Well, the Christmas story in Bethlehem may be the best known of all the Bible stories. Yet, how often do we think of the fact that the events of Bethlehem are spread across two stories, one from the Gospel of Luke and the other, the Gospel of Matthew? It's easy to see why we blend these two stories into one. We do that naturally because over the years, there's so many similarities that we see, So that's what we're going to look at. So for instance, okay? So Luke and Matthew both tell us where Jesus is born, in Bethlehem. They both tell us his mother is a virgin named Mary. They both tell us she's engaged to Joseph. They tell us that Joseph was descended from King David. Both Gospels tell us that the angel is the one that gives Jesus his name. Both tell us that the birth of Jesus is the fulfillment of Old Testament prophecy. Both tell us that Jesus is born during the reign of Herod. And both tell us that visitors come to see Jesus. But there's also different things that happen between the two stories. There's differences, especially concerning these visitors. You see, in Luke, we have shepherds, but we don't have any Magi. In Matthew, we have Magi, but we don't have any shepherds. So skeptics have questioned the historical evidence of Christmas because of differences like this. They think that Matthew and Luke must have written without knowledge of each other. But most scholars say Mark was written first, with no birth story at all. And Matthew and Luke, which are written later, they use the Gospel of Mark, some of it for their own writing, and then they add, including their own birth narratives. Now, this is bad for skeptics. You see, if Matthew and Luke are independent of each other, why are there so many similarities in their Christmas stories if the Christmas account, those things that happened, didn't really happen? That's one thing. Okay? Then the other thing is, if they've matched each other so similarly, it's probably because they're based on fact. And some say that Matthew or Luke did borrow from the other. And sure enough, that provides some inconsistencies as well. You see, because the skeptics will claim that makes the Gospels unworthy, untrustworthy. But this would have meant that Matthew or Luke would have used the other as a source, but would have made their account incompatible with the source. You get that? How if Matthew and Luke, let's say Matthew had Luke, and so Matthew has Luke, and Matthew puts inconsistencies in. In other words, he's talking about Magi, where Luke is talking about shepherds. It's kind of like, well, wait, how come there's inconsistencies? Well, if Matthew was making this stuff up, he wouldn't have had any inconsistencies. You see, it's so easy to figure out. What is likely is Luke and Matthew did know each other's accounts, but they have different emphases. So Matthew has the Magi. Luke has the shepherds. It doesn't mean that Matthew didn't know that there were shepherds, or Luke didn't know that there were Magi. This is just whom they choose to emphasize on Christmas. Now, this week I'm going to teach on shepherds and Magi. And then next week I'm going to follow up and consider this whole story from Mary and Joseph's perspective. So first, let's look at the shepherds. Mike? All right, so we got these shepherds. And we're told that they're outside watching over their flocks, and it's nighttime. Well, sheep in the Bible days were raised for wool. They were raised for milk, cheese, and meat. Some people would own flocks of sheep. All right, so they would own a whole bunch of them. The shepherds were working for some rich guy who has a bunch of sheep. All right, these people who own the flocks of sheep, that would be their primary income producer. But other people in Jesus' day might own just a few sheep to take care of their own extended family needs. So they would have the sheep in order to get the wool and the meat and milk and cheese and so forth for their own family and for their extended family. In Bible days, the extended family lived together in the same compound. And so there's a lot of people. So you could have several sheep yourself that would come in handy. But if you have flocks of sheep, you'd need to go out into the country and find grass and water in order for your sheep to live. The shepherds were usually men. However, we do know that there were some women who were shepherds too, because one of those ancient, well-known stories is the story of Rachel. Remember Rachel from the Old Testament? Rachel was a shepherd. And in the Old Testament, shepherds are actually looked upon in a positive way. Well, you're not going to want to cut up on shepherds that often because the great heroes of the Old Testament were shepherds. Abraham, shepherd. Moses, shepherd. King David himself, shepherd. So all have been shepherds by trade at one time in their life. But by the time Jesus comes around, in his day, shepherds are pretty low on the economic scale. If your family has a lot of sheep, you want to keep it in the family caring for those sheep. So what they do is they just pick the youngest son to be the one who's in charge of the sheep. So the youngest son has to watch the sheep and any other hired hands that they have. See, the youngest son is in Bible days, he's not going to inherit much of his father's wealth at all. And so he's usually the one who does the shepherding. Okay, you know that already. Remember we talked about King David. King David was the youngest son of Jesse, and he was the one that was chosen to be the shepherd. But regardless of who the shepherds were, they were usually the least educated people as well, because they started out young and to be a shepherd, and they didn't live in the village for great chunks of time. They'd be out in the fields. And when I say fields, it's not just the fields outside of their village. They would have to travel miles and miles and miles away to get water or to get the grass. And so because big chunks of the year they're out, they couldn't go to regular school like the other Jewish boys. Okay, they would go to school. All of them would go to school in the village, but not the shepherd kids. The shepherds are also considered the least spiritual. So, poor, uneducated, least spiritual. Now, why was that? Why is it the least spiritual? Well, a shepherd's job has many aspects that would cause him to be ritually unclean according to the Jewish laws. Okay? You can't be around blood, for instance. Well, if you're going to be a shepherd, there's going to be a lot of blood, whether it's birthing little lambs or, the whole meat part of it, right? Shepherds couldn't do anything that would in the synagogues, in the religious temple, going to the temple or anything, because they were unclean so much of the time. And the unclean laws, you don't just get washed up and you're clean. They take days and sometimes a whole month before you're considered clean again. So here's what shepherds can't do. They can't have weekly worship of God like the rest of the Jewish people. They can't celebrate the high holy days, the festivals. And those are really important. I mean, you're not even worth your salt if you're an adult male and you're not participating in the high holy days in Jerusalem. Nope, shepherds can't do that. All of these things, they'd be excluded. So without education, being without being an upstanding member of the religious community, shepherds, they just get stuck. They are poor. They're the poorest of all the people. A shepherd in Jesus' day would be maybe a step above a beggar. Okay? So it's far different. We got to remember this is far different. So these are not the society's best and brightest. Then Jesus comes along. With the coming of Jesus, we see what we can call a great reversal. The last shall be first. The greatest of you will be the servant of all. Being rich doesn't mean God blesses you specially. And being poor doesn't mean God is cursing you. See, all of these reversals are what common people throughout the history of the whole world thought. No. Jesus is turning it all upside down. The story of Christmas gets the ball rolling in the world being turned upside down. See, I'm going to teach more about that next week, but now I want us to think about what happens immediately after his birth. Consider whom God gives the birth announcement. Who does he give it to first? Not the king, not the chief priests, not the religious leaders, not the wealthy citizens of the capital city of Jerusalem. God announces the birth of his son first with poor, unclean, smelly shepherds. Let's listen to what happens. Or listen old school. So this is from Luke 2, King James Version. And there were in the same country shepherds abiding in the field, keeping watch over their flock by night. And lo, the angel of the Lord came upon them, and the glory of the Lord shone round about them, and they were sore afraid. And the angel said unto them, Fear not, for behold, I bring you good tidings of great joy, which shall be to all people. For unto you is born this day in the city of David a Savior, which is Christ the Lord. And this shall be a sign unto you. Ye shall find the babe wrapped in swaddling clothes, lying in a manger. And suddenly there was with the angel a multitude of the heavenly host, praising God and saying, Glory to God in the highest, and on earth peace, goodwill toward men. And it came to pass, as the angels were gone away from them into heaven, the shepherds said one to another, Let us now go even unto Bethlehem, and see this thing which is come to pass, which the Lord hath made known unto us. And they came with haste, and found Mary, and Joseph, and the babe lying in a manger. And when they had seen it, they made known abroad the saying which was told them concerning this child. And all they that heard it wondered at these things which were told them by the shepherds. The great reversal. The shepherds are the first witnesses of the newborn Messiah. First people to see Jesus other than his parents. Uncouth, uneducated, stinky, smelly, looked down upon, the dregs of society, shepherds. What does that mean? Well, it means God chooses the shepherds to hear the good news first, and it's probably because that's the best news for them, to know that the world is changing in this newborn baby. And even though lowly and unclean shepherds would be ignored by most civilized people, we look at the people's response. So, we could see them. Bethlehem is outside of Jerusalem. They're going to go into the capital city. It's only 5 miles away or whatever. So they're running into town, and these civilians, the normal people, the normal civilians, not the shepherds, what do? Well, they would just ignore shepherds. Look what it says. And all that heard it wondered at those things which were told them by the shepherds. So the assumption here is that people listened to the shepherds, and they didn't immediately reject what they had to say. So here are the first witnesses in Luke's Christmas story. Now, let's look at the first visitors in Matthew's Christmas story, the Magi. Michael, slide. Again, we have people outside of the religious community. So just like the shepherds, the Magi are outside of the religious community too, because the Magi aren't Jews. They're not Jewish. The Magi come from somewhere else. Now, how do we know that right away? Well, here's one of the ways we know that. This is the oldest piece of art in existence, which means so far, that shows the shepherd or shows the wise men and Mary and Joseph. Interesting. There's only two. Okay, so maybe the other guy got left out. Poor guy. But anyway, there's Joseph with a beard. There's Mary. There's baby Jesus. Okay, even in 200 A.D. This is when this is from. This is only it's less than 200 years after the time of Christ. So it's pretty accurate. This story is being handed down. But already by then, Jesus becomes like mini-man. Look at how big he is. Okay, so they're bringing him gifts. Well, what are they dressed like? Well, they have short robes. Well, the short robes are the robes of the Persians. If you were a wealthy Persian nobleman, you'd have a short robe on. And they don't have beards. Okay, male adults, if you're Jewish and you're a male adult, you have a beard. They don't have beards. They're not Jews. So these Magi don't worship the God of the Bible. They worship the gods of Persia. In fact, these Magi would be considered Gentiles by the Jews, including Mary and Joseph. Isn't that interesting? They still let them come into the house. So the Magi would be considered Gentiles. That's the Greek word. The Old Testament word for someone who is not Jewish is goyim. So you've heard that term if you have Jewish friends, If you get called a goyim, it's not always, it's kind of a little negative now. But it wasn't meant to, all that just means is you're not Jewish. Okay, next slide. The Magi are astrologers. And they're actually royal priests. We could trace this back not only by what they look like in the ancient art, but there's other accounts about them that are written that didn't make it in the Bible, because they probably weren't. It wasn't necessary to go into all the details. But we know from a very early time that these are royal priests, and the Persian religion is Zoroastrianism. Okay, Zoroastrianism was a religion, and that was a religion of Persia, and it's still going on today. A few months ago, I think I talked about Zoroastrianism. Freddie Mercury was a Zoroastrian, and he had a Zoroastrian funeral. And if you want to see a Zoroastrian temple, you can go to DeSoto and right by the Orange Line. Yeah, on Victory Boulevard. It's kind of cool looking. So anyway, they're called Magi. Well, the Magi is just simply a term for the priests, the royal priests, who help the king using their wisdom by studying the stars. And the word Magi comes from the Zoroastrian word magos. And magos, what word do we get from magos? Magic. That's where we get the word magic from. We get the word magic from these priests, from the Zoroastrian religion. So they study the heavenly skies and they make predictions. The Magi are wealthy themselves. So they make a good living. The king must reward them for their wisdom and all that, studying the stars and everything. And we know they're wealthy considering the cost of the gifts that they bring and considering the costs of travel. I mean, it's almost a 1,000-mile trip from Persia to Bethlehem. Okay? Now, we don't know how many Magi there were. We say 3 because that's how many gifts they bring. Okay? Could have been more. All right? Because they're rich And there are Old Testament prophecies that speak of foreign kings coming to worship the Messiah by the year 500 AD. Christian writers started calling the Magi kings. They did it because they just looked at the prophecies and said, well, in Psalms it says the kings are going to come and bow down to the Messiah. So they must have been kings. And from that moment on, all the commentators of the Bible from 500 AD on, they adopted this teaching that the three Magi were kings, even though scripturally they're not kings. They work for the king. They further named the three Magi in other writings, again, by about 500 AD. So this is ancient stuff. Isn't that interesting? They named them. They named Melchior, and he is from Persia. But then they said there's a couple of the other two priests were foreigners who came to Persia. Right? So there's Melchior, he's from Persia. Then there's Gaspar, he's from India. And then finally, Balthazar from Babylonia. So we've got these three kings. It's interesting that usually one of the kings is he has dark skin. And you always assume, well, if he has dark skin, he must be from some country in Africa. But no, he's Indian. He's from India. So you got to give a shout out to people from India, because one of the wise men was from there, okay? So, what is God showing us with Matthew's record? Well, non-Jews can figure out who Jesus is. That's one thing. And non-Jews can worship the Messiah too, without becoming Jewish. Both of these will be very important in just a few years from the birth of Jesus. The fact that you can figure out who Jesus is, even if you aren't Jewish, and that you can worship Jesus as the Messiah, but you don't have to become Jewish. So these Magi, going back, are witnesses to the Goyim area of the world. In other words, the non-Jewish areas of the world. And they are paying homage to Jesus when they come to Bethlehem in a normal home, rather than in a palace in Jerusalem. That's a big deal. And then there is symbolism in the gifts they bring. Gold is a gift fit for a king. And gold will come in handy for Joseph and Mary and Jesus because they're going to Egypt right after this to escape King Herod's soldiers, whom Herod ordered to kill any little kid that's less than 2 years old, any little boy. They rush to Egypt, Mary, Joseph, and Jesus, and they will have little possessions with them because they had gone down to Bethlehem for this, this tax registration. But they weren't going to stay there for a long time. They'd stay because their relatives are there. You'll hear about this next week. Their relatives are there, so they'd stay with them. But they didn't bring all their stuff. So now they're going to Egypt to escape. How are they going to afford that? Well, think about it. You got a bunch of gold. You can do anything you want. They probably went to Egypt and stayed at the Four Seasons, for crying out loud. Frankincense, or Frankenstein, as my granddaughter called it last week, okay? Frankincense is an incense. It's used to represent prayers. Like in ancient times, when you used incense, it was the smoke of the incense were going up to the heavens, and that's symbolic of prayers. So incense was prayers. Prayers to honor God. Myrrh is very rare and expensive. It's an ointment. We would call it a perfumed ointment. And myrrh is used for embalming. Kind of a strange gift, huh? But think of the symbolism of that. In fact, the symbolism was so strong that after, the Christmas account and the scriptures and all that, they started, they wrote other stories, kind of to try to fill in the gaps again. And the tradition has it that this myrrh may have been saved by Mary and used to embalm Jesus. So even at his birth, we have the reminder that there will come a day when his death will do something amazing. All right, so what happened to the Magi? Well, tradition holds that the Magi did become Christian. And then, like a lot of people who became Christian in those first 2 centuries, they got killed. They got executed. All right, because they went against, the official government, the gods of the government. So they were executed. Emperor Constantine allowed Christians in the Roman Empire by right around 315, 314. And so in 314, his mother, Helena, who had already secretly become a Christian, all right, now she could be a Christian legit, because he said, Christians will not be persecuted anymore. Leave the Christians alone. So Helena goes to the Holy Land. Constantine says, go find the most precious holy places in the Holy Land, and then we'll build churches there. So she goes to the Holy Land, and she visits the various sites. And while she's in Jerusalem, she discovers the bones of the 3 wise men. And so she takes those bones and she sends them to the biggest church that the Christians were building in the whole world in Constantinople, or Istanbul, called Saint Sophia, or Hagia Sophia is the way they say it today. So it's a big, huge church. It was the largest Christian church for centuries. So she brought those bones there, but then they were stolen by a bunch of Italian sailors. There they go again. Remember last week they stole the St. Nicholas's bones? Who's Italian in this room? What the heck's wrong with you people? No wonder we have all these gangster movies and the mafia. You guys are taking all this stuff. Never mind. All right. So anyway, those bones were taken to Milan, but then in 1164, the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick I was fighting with the Milanese, or however you say it, Milanese, their army, and he won. So he grabbed those bones, and he brought them back to Cologne in Germany. All right? And there they were placed in, go ahead, Mike. They were placed in that box made out of gold. And they were put in the Cologne. Cologne is the way that we say it. It's Köln in German. That's why probably easier to say Cologne. So anyway, Köln Cathedral. So it's in the cathedral, and this cathedral is very famous because the bones are there, and it's called the Shrine of the 3 Kings. So it is there today. Well, if you've got the bones of the 3 kings in this beautiful shrine, and people are coming from all over, guess what time of the year it's most popular? Christmas. And sure enough, the towns in Germany, they have what's called Christmas markets, which just means huge celebrations for Christmas. And the most famous one, the biggest one and the most famous one, is the Cologne Cathedral Christmas market. Now that Christmas market and that cathedral have been famous for years. Okay, this is like in the 1600s, all right? So what they did, it was 1100s that he brought the bones there. By the 1600s, you got these big celebrations at the Cologne Theater, and they had living nativity. So their big specialty was on Christmas Eve, they'd have live animals, and they'd have people representing, Jesus and the wise men and all that other stuff. And they had a big concert. Their organist and their choir was the most famous one around. So it was a big deal. So thousands of people would come to worship on Christmas Eve. So in 1670, all right, the choir master was perturbed because he'd have this big concert and it lasted a long time, and people would bring their kids and they didn't dismiss them to Sunday school. So they were there. And the kids were so restless during this hours-long event that the choir master figured, I got to do something about this. Okay? Be like Rob saying, man, there's too much noise with these kids. I got to do something about this, all right? However, in order to do that, he needed the approval of the head priest, or like Rob. He can't just do whatever he wants. I mean, Rob, generally, because you are a man of God. But anyway, you got to kind of get the senior pastor. You got to kind of get the head priest on board. So here's what happened. He goes to a candy maker, and he says, I want these kids to have something in their mouth for a long time. What could it be? This is a true story. Remember last week I had all these fascinating, here we go with another one. So he said, let's make a sugar stick. So he makes a sugar stick, and then the choir master says, my boss isn't going to go for that. It's got to have more religious symbolism, okay? Else everybody's going to, why are they handing out candy to kids, on Christmas Eve? So the candy maker, he says, here's what we'll do. He said, let's put white stripes and red stripes. And the red stripes, we can teach about Jesus. The red stripes, the blood of Jesus. The white stripes makes us pure and clean. And they did. And that's where the candy cane colors come from. But wait, candy cane, it's not a stick. The choir master said, let's take the end and make a hook out of it so it looks like a shepherd's cane. And they did. And that's where the first candy cane was made. So that symbolism is really wild. And it's like one of those Kevin Bacon things, you remember the 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon? You got the wise men, these 3 magi, and ultimately they are responsible for candy canes. Right? Isn't that interesting? Because of all the things that happen. So, there you have it. We got the shepherds, we got the magi, we got these two different visitors to Bethlehem. All right, next slide. This is the last one, Michael. Oh, that's not the last one. Look at how beautiful that is. That's the cathedral. And you see in the front. Well, go back to that again. That was kind of cool. You see how that's all like the Christmas market where they sell things and they have food and drink and all that. That's amazing. I got to go there someday. Man, look at that. At Christmas time, of course. All right, next. There's your candy cane. Last slide. All right, so here is a normal nativity scene. You see the wise men, you see the shepherds, you see the angels. Now you know how it all came together. Okay? So that scene didn't actually ever really occur, but it's very easy just to take the stories and to blend them. And so that's what we have. But there's something that's really important with this whole thing when we look at the shepherds and the wise men. My friend Bob Rogland, he just finished his new book. It's going to be published. It's published in January. So anyway, it's called Recovering the Way. And I love the way that he talks about this in his new book. So I'm going to read just this final paragraph from Bob's book. There could hardly be 2 more different groups in our world. The lowly Jewish shepherds, stinky and filthy from sleeping in the fields with their sheep, considered unclean by religious leaders of their time, but testifying to an angelic encounter. And then Bob says, contrasted with the wealthy and respected pagan astrologers who had the means and opportunity to travel across the Middle East on a political mission. See, they wanted to find the king of the Jews, right? The Messiah. So it was really a political mission in many ways. They traveled across the Middle East on a political mission, offering expensive gifts in homage to a powerful new ruler. And here's how Bob concludes it. I love this conclusion. I'm concluding this message with this. Jesus was born for all of humanity, both Jew and Gentile, rich and poor, powerful and lowly. Amen.